The dinner I made on my birthday was for 2 people. I knew by the time I set the second plate that nobody was coming. I knew it in the particular way you know things that you've been refusing to know for several weeks. Not as a sudden revelation, but as the conclusion of a slow accumulation that you've been stepping around carefully, choosing your angle every morning so that the accumulation stays in your peripheral vision rather than directly in front of you. I set the second plate anyway. I'm not sure I could explain that decision to anyone's full satisfaction. It wasn't hope exactly. It was more like the refusal to let the evening become what it was clearly becoming before it absolutely had to. I sat down at 7:45. The food was good. I've cooked for myself long enough to have developed a reasonable standard. Nora used to say that the problem with teaching me to cook was that I'd become too systematic about it. That I approached a recipe the way I approached a photography assignment, with a methodology and a checklist and a particular idea of what the finished result should look like, which produced consistent results but not much spontaneity. She was right about that, and about most things she observed about me. She was right about more things than I knew at the time, which is a sentence that applies, in my experience, to most marriages that last long enough to be properly understood. At 8:17 p.m., someone knocked on the front door. I know the time precisely because I'd been watching the clock without meaning to. The way you watch a clock when you're performing the act of not watching a clock, which takes considerably more energy than just watching it. 8:17 p.m. On a Tuesday evening in October, my 73rd birthday, with a second plate set and the Eugene Rain doing what Eugene Rain does in October, which is everything. I got up from the table. Martin Keene was standing on my porch. I've known Martin for 11 years. He moved to Alderbrook Terrace in the period just after Nora died, which means our friendship, such as it is, has developed entirely in the context of me living alone. He was a postal supervisor for most of his working life, a profession that produces a specific kind of person, someone with a high tolerance for systematic process, an acute sense of when things are where they should be and when they aren't, and the patience that comes from decades of understanding that the delivery of things to the right place at the right time is not always as straightforward as it appears from the outside. He was holding a photograph. Not casually, not the way a person holds a photograph they've found and are bringing over to share. He was holding it the way a person holds something they've been carrying for longer than they wanted to, and have finally decided to deliver. I said, "Did something happen?" Martin looked at me for several seconds before answering. Not the ordinary pause of a man thinking about what to say. The pause of a man who has already thought about what to say and is now deciding whether to say it. He said, "I don't know how to tell you this without hurting you." I looked at the photograph. It showed 2 people standing outside a house I recognized immediately. The house Nora and I had lived in before we moved to Alderbrook Terrace, the house on Merrifield Avenue where we'd spent the middle years of our life together. The 2 people were Nora and me. We were younger in it. I couldn't have placed the year exactly, but the quality of the light and the clothing and the particular way we were standing suggested the early part of a period I still think of as when things were still uncomplicated, which is the way most people think about the years before they discovered that things were more complicated than they'd known. Martin turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting I recognized without any process of identification, recognized the way you recognize the shape of a coastline you've looked at for decades, immediately and completely, was a single handwritten sentence. He promised he would never tell them. I looked at Martin. He said, "Your family didn't stop coming because they stopped loving you." I had not told Martin that my family had stopped coming. I had not told anyone. I had been conducting, for 6 weeks, the specific performance of a person who is managing things fine and doesn't require concern, which is a performance that I've had a great deal of practice with and that I had believed was convincing. He said, "They stopped coming because they believe something about you that isn't true." I said, "What do they believe?" He hesitated. The hesitation of a man who has delivered difficult things in his career, who has handed people notifications and packages and official correspondence that changed the circumstances of their day, and who still, after all that practice, finds the moment before delivery the hardest part. He handed me a sealed envelope. "That's why I came tonight," he said. He didn't come inside. I didn't ask him to. Some conversations need a threshold between them, a space where the thing that's been said has room to exist before the next thing is added to it. Martin understood that. He said he'd be home if I wanted to talk later. Then he went back down the porch steps into the October rain. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my house at 1178 Alderbrook Terrace with a sealed envelope in one hand and a photograph of my wife and me in the other. The dinner I'd made for two was still on the table. The second plate was still set. I went to the kitchen table and sat down. I put the photograph face up in front of me. I looked at Nora's handwriting on the back of it, at the sentence she'd written, which I was going to need to think about carefully because the sentence was not ambiguous, but its meaning was not yet clear to me, which is a condition I was familiar with from 30 years of teaching photography. A clear image can still take time to develop into its full meaning. The image being clear doesn't mean you're done with it. He promised he would never tell them. The envelope was not thick. Whatever Martin had brought me was not a large collection of materials. I opened it. Inside were copies of photographs, 4 of them. Not large, standard print size, the kind you'd develop from film or print from a digital file without particular ambition about the format. Each one appeared ordinary. Photographs of places and occasions I recognized from various periods of our life. On the back of each one, a handwritten sentence in Nora's hand. The first, he thinks silence protects people. The second, he doesn't know what they heard. The third, if they ever find out, they will blame him. The fourth, I never wanted this to happen. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Let me tell you about Nora before I tell you what the sentences meant, because understanding what the sentences meant requires understanding who wrote them. Nora Whitaker was not a cryptic person, that's the first thing. She communicated directly, in complete sentences, with the specific precision of someone who had spent her working years managing a nonprofit's communications and had developed through that work a genuine respect for the accuracy of language. She believed that unclear communication was usually the result of unclear thinking, and she held herself to the same standard she applied to that belief. When she wanted to say something, she said it. This made the sentences on the photographs disorienting in a way that went beyond their content. Not just what they said, but the fact that she had written them in this form. Cryptic, fragmented, each one a piece of something larger without the larger thing provided. That wasn't how Nora wrote. That wasn't how Nora thought, which meant she had written them this way deliberately, for an audience who wouldn't have full context. I thought about that while the rain continued outside, and the second place setting remained on the table, and the October dark settled into the specific quality that Eugene evenings have in autumn. A particular darkness that isn't heavy but is complete, the kind that makes a lit room feel both warmer and more exposed than it does in other seasons. I have been a photography instructor for most of my adult life. I taught at Lane Community College for 27 years before I retired. The thing I spent those years trying to teach, the thing that took most students significantly longer than they expected to learn, was that a photograph is never simply what it shows. It is what it shows in relationship to everything it doesn't show. The frame is not just the boundary of the image, it is the editorial decision that determines what meaning is possible. Change the frame and you change what the image can mean, even if nothing inside the frame has changed. I had been looking at 6 weeks of my family's absence through a particular frame. The frame was, they are busy or they are dealing with things in their own lives, or the natural drift of adult relationships has simply created a temporary gap that will close on its own. Martin's envelope had just changed the frame. The image inside it, my family's absence, the silence of the phone, the birthday that nobody called about, hadn't changed. But what it could mean had changed completely. They believe something about you that isn't true. I went to the living room, sat in the chair I've been sitting in since Nora died. The one by the window that gets the morning light when there's morning light to get, and that looks out toward the driveway and the street beyond it. The chair from which I'd been watching the driveway for 6 weeks without quite admitting that was what I was doing. I thought about my sons. Daniel is 46. He works as a civil engineer about an hour north of Eugene, a drive that in ordinary circumstances presented no obstacle to the visits and phone calls that had been regular features of the previous several years. He's always been the more measured of the two, the one who thinks before he speaks, who approaches problems the way a civil engineer approaches problems, which is to say with a preference for understanding the load-bearing elements before making decisions about the aesthetics. I've always respected that about him. I've occasionally found it frustrating in the way that you find admirable qualities in people frustrating when they're producing outcomes you don't like. In the past 6 weeks, when I'd called Daniel and he'd answered, Not always. But sometimes, he had said something that had stayed with me in the way that phrases stay with you when they mean more than they appear to contain. He had said, "I'm not ready to talk about it." I had interpreted this as referring to something in his own life. A difficulty at work, a private concern, something that would resolve itself and that he would tell me about when it had. Daniel is not a man who brings incomplete information to conversations. He waits until he understands a situation before he discusses it, which is consistent with the engineering mind. Now I was sitting in the chair by the window, understanding that it might not have been something in Daniel's life. Thomas is 39. He lives in Bend, about 2 hours east, and has always been the more emotionally expressive of my two sons, the one who calls without particular occasion, who tells you what he's thinking before he's fully finished thinking it, who says the important things directly because he genuinely doesn't understand why anyone would approach them indirectly. He and I have always had an easiness in conversation that Daniel and I have had to develop more deliberately. It's not that Daniel and I are close with difficulty. It's that Thomas and I are close with ease, and the two kinds of closeness feel different and mean different things. Thomas's silence had been the one that confused me most, because Thomas didn't go quiet. Thomas went quiet the way a stream goes quiet. It suggested that something had stopped the flow, and streams don't stop for ordinary reasons. I sat in the chair by the window and I looked at the 4 photographs on my lap. He thinks silence protects people. I've spent most of my adult life understanding that as a truth about photography. The decision about what to include in a frame and what to exclude is always, in some measure, a decision about protection. You protect your subject from certain kinds of exposure. You protect your audience from certain kinds of information. You protect the integrity of a moment by not including the elements that would undermine it. Framing is a form of silence. It is the decision to not say certain things in order to say others more clearly. But Nora was not writing about photography. I knew that immediately. She was writing about something specific, something that had happened between us and that she believed had consequences she hadn't intended, and she was writing about it in this fragmented form because she'd anticipated a moment when the consequences would become visible without the context that would explain them. She had been preparing for a conversation she wasn't going to be there to have. The thought of that, of Nora understanding clearly enough what was going to happen to prepare materials for it years before it happened, while I had been in the same house and the same marriage and had not known, produced something in me that I want to be accurate about because I think accuracy matters when you're describing the way things actually feel rather than the way they seem like they should feel. It wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more complicated than anger. The specific feeling of discovering that someone you loved completely and thought you understood had been carrying a particular knowledge that you hadn't shared. Not because she'd been hiding it from you, because she'd understood something about the future that you hadn't yet arrived at, and she'd been living alongside the understanding without burdening you with it. And now the understanding had arrived, and she wasn't there to walk you through it. I missed her very specifically in that moment. Not the general way that widowers miss their spouses, the ambient grief that becomes part of the texture of an ordinary day, the specific way of needing someone who is not there, needing their particular mind and their particular directness and the specific quality of their understanding of you. He doesn't know what they heard. This was the sentence I kept returning to. What had they heard? And when? And from whom? I taught photography for 27 years. In those years, I maintained a significant relationship with the Lane County Community Photography Archive, a collection of thousands of photographs donated by local residents across several decades, documenting the county's social and architectural history. It was a project that had mattered to me professionally and personally, one of the things I'd been most proud of from my teaching years. Several years before I retired, a disagreement had developed over a portion of the archive. Not a dramatic disagreement, not the kind that produces headlines or formal disputes or anything that would be visible from the outside. The quiet, complicated kind of disagreement that develops when people have different assumptions about ownership and access, and the right to determine the terms of a record that multiple people feel connected to. Among the photographs in the archive were several that depicted adult members of my extended family, not just my immediate family, but the broader network of relatives and acquaintances that a family accumulates across a life in one region. One of those photographs had been the subject of a specific and private request. I had honored that request. I had said no to releasing the photograph. I had not explained why. I had simply declined, in the professional manner of a person managing an archive who had authority over access decisions, without providing the reasoning that would have made the decision comprehensible. That was where it had begun. Or at least, that was where I thought it had begun. Sitting in the chair by the window on my birthday at just past 9 o'clock, with the rain on the windows and the photographs on my lap, and Martin's envelope on the side table, I was beginning to understand that what I had thought of as a resolved professional decision might have been living a separate life in other people's understanding of me for years. Developing in the dark, the way a photograph develops, the image becoming clearer over time, the contrast sharpening, the details emerging that weren't visible in the initial exposure. I had not thought of myself as a person who used silence as a weapon. I had thought of myself as a person who used silence as a form of respect for the people who trusted me, for the privacy that certain kinds of information require, for the principle that some things belong to the people they belong to and not to everyone who is curious about them. But the thing about silence, as I knew from photography, and as I was in the process of understanding from something much more personal, is that it does not stay neutral. It does not simply occupy the space you assign it. It moves. It migrates into other people's understanding and takes on the shape of whatever container they provide for it. I had provided no container. I had simply been quiet and had trusted the quiet to be understood as what I intended it to be. The October rain intensified slightly, a brief increase in volume before settling back into its steady, ordinary rhythm. I listened to it against the windows. I'd been listening to rain on these windows for 11 years. I knew its sound at every intensity, in every season, against every quality of night air. I did not know what my sons had heard. I did not know what they believed. I did not know what portion of the story had reached them, or how it had been modified in the reaching, or why they had decided, Thomas especially, Thomas who told you what he was thinking before he'd finished thinking it, to believe something about their father without asking him whether it was true. I picked up the first photograph again. I looked at Nora's face in it, at the specific quality of how she was standing, which I recognized as the way she stood when she was content. A particular ease in the shoulders, a quality of being fully present in the moment, rather than partly somewhere else. We were happy in that photograph. Whatever year it was, whatever occasion had produced it, we were happy. I knew that without any process of analysis. And on the back, in her handwriting, he promised he would never tell them. The promised. Past tense. Something had already been agreed to when she wrote that sentence. I turned the photograph over again and looked at both sides as though I were looking at two photographs, the image and its caption, the document and its annotation, and I tried to understand what Nora had known and what she had done with knowing it, and why she had trusted Martin Keene, a retired postal supervisor who had moved to the neighborhood after she was gone, with a box of materials that she had assembled for a conversation she would not be there to participate in. There were things in that box that I hadn't yet seen. Martin had the originals. He had copies of what he'd given me. There was more in the box than 4 photographs and an envelope. I had been a photographer long enough to know that the contact sheet is never the final image. What Martin had brought me was the contact sheet, a way to see what existed before deciding what to print, what to enlarge, what to examine more closely. The full exposure was still in his possession. I looked at the clock. 9:23 p.m. He had said he'd be home if I wanted to talk. I put on my coat. The rain outside had the specific temperature of October in the Willamette Valley. Cold enough to be serious, not cold enough to be cruel. I walked 3 houses down Alderbrook Terrace with my collar up and the envelope under my arm and the 4 photographs in my coat pocket, and I knocked on Martin Keene's door. He answered quickly, which told me he'd been expecting me. He stood aside and let me in. His living room had the organized quality of a man who has lived alone long enough to have developed systems that satisfy him. Not sparse, not excessive, the room of someone who knows what he needs and has arranged it accordingly. He had a small wooden table near the window with a box on it. Not large, the kind of box that holds a modest amount of material without requiring storage above its station. I looked at the box. He looked at me. I said, "Tell me everything." He sat down. I sat down across from him, and what he told me across the next hour, about Nora, about the box, about what she had asked him to do and when and why, rearrange the architecture of the past 6 weeks in a way that made the shape of it entirely different, without changing a single fact of what had actually happened. But there was one thing he told me, toward the end of the hour, that stopped the room. One specific detail about who had sent my sons the email they'd received, and what portion of it they had seen, and what portion had been removed before it reached them. I sat very still when he told me, because I recognized, in what he was describing, not just the misunderstanding that had produced 6 weeks of silence. I recognized my own contribution to it. The thing I had done, not maliciously, not even consciously, that had made the misunderstanding possible, that had given the silence a shape that my sons could fill with the wrong explanation. Martin was watching me. I said, "There was an email." He said, "Yes." I said, "From Nora." He said, "Yes, but not the whole email." I looked at the box on the table. "The rest of it is in there," he said. I reached forward and opened the box. The box contained more than I expected. Not in volume. It wasn't large. It wasn't overflowing. It didn't have the dramatic weight of something that had been accumulating for decades. It was modest in the way that Nora was modest about everything that mattered to her. She never believed that importance required scale. She thought the opposite, actually, that the things with the most genuine weight were usually the ones that took up the least physical space, because they didn't need size to make themselves felt. Inside the box, a small collection of photographs, the originals of which Martin had given me copies. A folded letter addressed to me in Nora's handwriting, a printed email, 2 pages, the second page clearly the continuation of something that had been cut off. And at the bottom of the box, a small notebook, the kind with the soft cardboard cover that artists and students carry, in which Nora had written what appeared to be notes in a format I didn't immediately recognize. I picked up the printed email first, not because it was on top, because Martin had said the word email, and I needed to see what he meant before I could process anything else. The first page was familiar in the way that something becomes familiar when you've never seen it, but you immediately understand it. The format of an old email printout, the header showing a date from several years before Nora died, her email address in the sender field. The recipient was a name I recognized, a cousin of Nora's named Dorothy, who had been in occasional contact with our family across the years, a woman who now lived in Portland and whom I'd met at perhaps a dozen occasions over as many decades. The email was, on its surface, ordinary. Nora was writing to Dorothy about a visit they'd been planning, about some shared family history they'd been discussing, about mutual connections. The tone was warm and specific. Nora wrote to people the way she talked to them, with full attention and no filler. 2/3 of the first page was that kind of content, genuine, engaged, the correspondence of 2 people who cared about each other and had things to say. Then, at the bottom of the first page, the email shifted. Nora had written, "There's something I've been thinking about regarding the archive situation. I want you to understand what actually happened, because I'm afraid a version of it has been circulating that isn't accurate. Samuel made the decision he made because..." The first page ended there. I turned to the second page. The second page did not continue from that sentence. It picked up a new paragraph that was clearly from a different section of the email. Nora, returning to the plans for the visit, asking about Dorothy's schedule, the kind of logistical content that concludes a letter. The section that should have connected those 2 pages was missing. I held the 2 pages, and I looked at the gap between them, the way I look at the space in a photograph that should contain something. The negative space that tells you something was once there, or should have been there, or was removed from there. Empty space is never neutral. It contains the shape of whatever belongs in it. Martin said, "It was forwarded. The email. Someone forwarded it to Daniel, but the middle section was gone before it reached him." I said, "The section that explained why I made the decision." "Yes." "And Daniel forwarded it to Thomas." Martin nodded. "Who gave Dorothy the email?" I asked. Martin was quiet for a moment. "Nora's cousin had shown it to someone else years ago, someone she trusted. That person eventually, not maliciously I don't think, mentioned certain parts of it in a conversation with a family member you both know. The conversation got repeated, By the time it got to Daniel, the original email was gone and what remained was a summary of what people remembered. And then someone found the actual email in an old folder and forwarded it. But by then, whoever forwarded it only had the partial version. So nobody deliberately removed the middle section, I said. Not as far as I can tell, Martin said. It looks more like the original email was long enough that someone saved it in sections, or that it was split across a screen and the middle page was simply never printed or saved, and then the incomplete version was the only one anyone could find. I sat back. There is a thing that happens in photography when you've worked with film long enough, when you've spent enough years in darkrooms understanding the chemistry of image development. You learn that the most dangerous moment is not when something goes wrong. It is when something goes partially right. A fully failed photograph is useless and you know it immediately. But a partially developed image, an image that has some of what it needs to communicate but is missing a crucial element, is the most dangerous kind of error, because it looks like something. It has enough information to be convincing. It will be read as a complete image by anyone who doesn't know what's missing. My family had been working from a partially developed image of me for years, and I had been the one who had, without knowing it, left the image incomplete. Martin reached into the box and handed me the second page, the one I hadn't yet seen, the actual continuation of Nora's email, which she had evidently saved separately or which had been stored differently from the partial version that had reached Daniel. I read the missing section. Nora had written, "Samuel made the decision he made because I asked him to." One of the photographs in the archive, the one that was the source of the disagreement, was a photograph that included me, from a period in my life that I have never discussed publicly. I was not ready for that period to become part of a community record. I asked Samuel to decline the request for access, and he did. He didn't tell anyone why because I asked him not to. The decision looks, without that context, like Samuel being protective of something. He was. He was being protective of me. I've never told this to anyone outside of the two of us. And I'm only telling you now because I trust you and because I think someone eventually needs to know that Samuel acted from loyalty rather than from whatever other motive people have been assuming. I set the page down. The room was very quiet. Martin was looking at me with the specific expression of a person who has read something they didn't fully understand until the person it concerns is sitting across from them reacting to it. I said, "She told Dorothy?" "Yes." But Dorothy's version of it, or whoever she told, got separated from the explanation before it reached my sons. That's what it looks like. I thought about the photography archive, about the day the request had come in. I could still recall the specific quality of that morning, the administrative details of it. The way the request had been filed and how I'd processed it and then gone home and had the conversation with Nora and come back the following day and declined the request in the official manner without providing official reasoning. I thought about the conversations that had happened afterward, the mild confusion, the brief professional friction, the eventual settling of the matter without resolution. I had thought of it as settled. I had thought of the silence that followed as the natural silence of a resolved disagreement. It had not been resolved. It had been suspended. The unexplained decision had continued existing in other people's understanding, developing very slowly in the dark until circumstances, an old email found in someone's folder, a forwarded message, a missing page, had brought it back into the light in its incomplete form. I picked up the letter addressed to me. I didn't open it immediately. I looked at the outside of it, at my name in Nora's handwriting, at the envelope that was sealed in a way that told me it had been sealed with intention, not casually. She had put something in this envelope and closed it and given it to Martin with the specific instruction that he should bring it to me if my family ever stopped speaking to me. She had known this was possible. She had known because she understood the risk that her privacy, maintained through my silence, created. She had understood that the silence designed to protect her might eventually become a silence that appeared to be concealing something else, and she had created a correction, a mechanism for restoring the accurate picture, that she wouldn't be there to deploy herself. I thought about that, about Nora at her desk somewhere in the years before she died, writing these letters and preparing these photographs and giving Martin a box with instructions about when to use it, doing all of that quietly, without telling me, because telling me would have required explaining what she was afraid of, and she hadn't wanted to burden me with what she was afraid of. She had been protecting me. from the knowledge of what her privacy might cost me. And in doing so, she had, in the particular irony of people who love each other and try to manage each other's experiences of that love, made the thing she was afraid of more likely rather than less. Because if she'd told me, I might have been able to prevent it. But she hadn't told me, and I hadn't known to prevent anything. And so here we were in Martin Keene's living room on a Tuesday night in October with a box between us and 6 weeks of my family's absence on the table. I said, "She prepared all of this without telling me she was doing it." Martin said, "She told me when she gave me the box that she hoped I'd never need to open it. But she prepared it anyway." Yes, I understood that completely. It was exactly what Nora would have done. She prepared for things she hoped wouldn't happen because the alternative, being unprepared for them, was more frightening to her than the preparation itself. I opened the letter. It was 2 pages in her hand. She had written, "Samuel, if you're reading this, Martin followed my instructions, which means something happened that I always hoped wouldn't and always knew might. I want to tell you some things. First, I'm sorry. Not for asking you to keep the promise. I'm not sorry for that. And I don't want you to think I am, because the promise was real, and what you did by keeping it was right. I'm sorry that a promise I asked you to keep may have become, through no fault of either of us, the thing that made you look like something you aren't, to the people who should know you best. Second, you had nothing to do with the misunderstanding except in one specific way. You kept my confidence, which was right, but you also never told anyone that there was a confidence being kept. You never said, "I can't tell you the reason, but there is one, and it belongs to someone else." You just became quiet. And quiet, Samuel, has never been neutral ground for the people who love you. It becomes the territory they fill with whatever worries them most. Third, and this is the most important thing I want you to hear, I never wanted you to spend the rest of your life defending yourself because of a promise you made to me. I'm not asking you to break the promise even now, but I am asking you to tell them what you can. Tell them that a promise existed. Tell them that the silence had a reason. You don't have to give them the reason. Give them the frame. People can live with incomplete pictures if they know the picture is incomplete. What they can't live with is believing the picture is complete when it isn't. The photograph in the box, the one from Merrifield Avenue, I want you to have it back. I left it with Martin because it was taken during the period I kept private, and I didn't want it to be found before any of this was understood. Now you can decide what to do with it. I trust you to handle this correctly. I always have. That's the reason I asked you to keep the promise in the first place. With all of it, Nora. I folded the letter, put it back in the envelope. Martin was looking at the window. Outside, the October rain continued. He had the quality of a person who has done the thing they were asked to do and is now simply present while the consequences of doing it develop around him. I said, "Thank you for keeping the box." He said, "She was very specific about the instructions." She was specific about everything. We sat in comfortable quiet for a few minutes. Not the uncomfortable silence of people who don't know what to say. The other kind. The silence of people who have said the necessary things and are giving them the space required. Then I asked, "How long did you have the box before you brought it to me?" 2 days, he said. "After your birthday passed without anyone coming." I understood that was the moment she'd been describing. She'd said the birthday would be the sign. She said if a birthday passed without the family, that was when she'd want me to act. He paused. I tried to think of a better way to do it. I couldn't find one. "There isn't a better way," I said. "There's just the way it happened." I went home with the box. I sat in the chair by the window for several hours, not reading or looking at anything specifically, just thinking in the way that requires stillness rather than activity. I thought about Nora's letter, and about the missing page of the email, and about Daniel saying I'm not ready to talk about it, and about Thomas, who had always been the one who told me everything, going completely quiet. I thought about what Nora had written about the frame. Give them the frame. People can live with incomplete pictures if they know the picture is incomplete. She was right. She was describing something I knew from 30 years of teaching photography that I had somehow not applied to the most personal version of my own life. In the classroom, I had taught students to be honest about their frames, to acknowledge what they were including and, crucially, what they were choosing not to include. An ethical photograph was not necessarily one that showed everything. It was one that was honest about the fact that it was showing something rather than everything. I had not been honest about my frame. I had kept Nora's confidence, which was right, but I had allowed people to believe that my silence was the whole picture rather than a choice about where to put the boundary. And the difference between those two things, between a silence that acknowledges itself as a silence and a silence that allows itself to be mistaken for a complete account, is the difference between a kept promise and a misrepresentation. I had not been dishonest, but I had been, in the specific technical sense of the word I'd spent decades teaching, out of focus. Here is what I want to say directly to the people who are watching this story, because this is the part that I think matters beyond the specifics of Samuel Whitaker and his late wife's box of photographs. Most of us have been in a version of this situation, not necessarily this exact situation, not with a photography archive and a missing email and a neighbor with a box, but the underlying situation. We have kept something private, for good reasons, and the privacy has migrated into other people's understanding and become something different from what we intended. Or we have been on the other side. We have believed something about someone we love, based on incomplete information, and we have decided that our incomplete information was sufficient to justify distance. The gap between those two positions, between the person keeping a necessary silence and the person filling that silence with the wrong explanation, is where most family misunderstandings live, not in malice, not in the perfectly understandable human tendency to complete incomplete pictures. The question is what you do once you understand the gap exists. If this is landing somewhere for you, if there's someone in your life who has become quieter than you understand, or if you've been the quiet one and you're watching someone else try to fill your silence, stay with this story. Because what happened next is the part that required the most from me, and it produced the most. The following morning I called Thomas, not because I had decided exactly what to say, because Nora's letter had told me to give people the frame, and I understood what that meant, and I understood that the longest distance I could travel toward it was to pick up the phone and dial. Thomas answered on the second ring, which surprised me. He'd been answering inconsistently for 6 weeks, sometimes immediately, sometimes after several attempts, sometimes not at all. The second ring answer felt significant, though I was aware that I was reading significance into things that might simply be coincidence, which is a habit that heightens during periods of uncertainty and that I've learned to acknowledge without fully trusting. He said, "Dad," the way he said it told me something I couldn't have fully articulated. Not warm exactly, not the warmth of our ordinary calls, the calls without agenda. More careful. The word delivered with the specific quality of a person who has been thinking about what they would say when this call came. I said, "I know something happened. I want to talk about it." Silence on the line. I said, "I'm not going to ask you to tell me what you heard. I'm going to tell you that there's context you don't have, and I want to give you that context, and then I want you to ask me whatever questions you have." A longer silence. Then Thomas said, "How long have you known we stopped coming?" "Since it started," I said. I told myself other things for a while, but I knew. "And you didn't call?" "No," I said. "I didn't call because I didn't know what I'd done and I was afraid to find out." I paused. That was wrong. I should have called sooner. Another silence. Thomas said, "We heard something, Dad. About the archive. About a photograph." "I know," I said. "Daniel found an email from Mom. I know about the email." Silence. He said, "Did she—" He stopped, started again. "Did Mom know about the photograph situation? Did she know what people were saying about it?" I said, "Yes. She knew everything about it. She knew more than I did about what people were saying, it turns out." "Then why didn't she—" "Because she was trying to protect me," I said. "The same way I was trying to protect her. The same way you and Daniel were trying to protect yourselves from something that felt too complicated to approach directly." I paused. We were all trying to protect someone. And all the protection added up to 6 weeks of nobody talking to each other. The rain had started again outside, softer this morning, the overnight rain giving way to the lighter, more persistent kind that Oregon does in the middle of October when it has committed to the season. Thomas said, "I didn't think you'd actually done anything wrong." I said, "You didn't think I had?" "Not really. Not when I was being honest with myself." He was quiet. But Daniel was so certain, and Rachel. And once they were certain, it was easier to go along with the certainty than to stand against it alone. I understood that completely. There is a specific gravity to a shared certainty within a family. It has the weight not just of the individual conviction, but of everyone else's conviction reinforcing it. And standing against that weight alone requires a kind of courage that even emotionally expressive people don't always have in the moment. I said, "I need to meet with all three of you and Daniel and Rachel, face to face." "When?" "Whenever you can," I said. "Not a phone call, in person." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I'll call Daniel." I said, "Tell him I'm not angry. Tell him I just need to explain something I should have explained a long time ago." After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I thought about what I would say when I saw them. Not in the way of preparing a speech. Nora's letter had said not to fight them with more silence, and a prepared speech is its own kind of silence. It's the performance of communication rather than communication itself. I thought about what was actually true and how to say it simply enough that it had room to be heard. There was one decision I'd already made clearly in the hours since I'd read Nora's letter. I was not going to tell them the specific thing she'd asked me to keep private. Even now, even to correct the misunderstanding, even to remove every remaining shadow from my own reputation in their understanding, I was not going to do it, because Nora had not released me from the promise. She had asked me to tell them that a promise existed. She had given me the frame. She had not given me permission to fill it with her private history. And beyond the promise, there was something else. Nora's privacy was Nora's. She was gone. She could not revise her wishes. She could not decide, in response to new circumstances, that the private thing was now acceptable to share. I could not make that decision for her. The fact that keeping the promise had created difficulties for me did not transfer to me the right to resolve those difficulties at her expense. This was going to be the hardest part, because the easy resolution, the one that restored everything simply and completely, that provided full context and removed all remaining ambiguity, required giving them the specific information Nora had kept private. And the harder resolution, the right one, required me to tell them only that the information existed and that it was not mine to give. I was going to have to trust them to believe me without the evidence. I was going to have to trust the relationship, which was, I was slowly understanding, exactly what I should have done years ago. The cafe where we agreed to meet was on the south side of the river, a quiet place. Not a coffee shop where everyone is working on something and the ambient noise is the sound of productivity, but a cafe in the older sense, a place where people sit and talk and the environment supports the talking rather than competing with it. I had suggested it and Daniel had agreed, which told me he was approaching the meeting with some openness. Daniel doesn't agree to locations without thinking about them. They arrived within a few minutes of each other. Daniel first, driving from the north, arriving with the specific quality of someone who has prepared himself for a conversation without knowing exactly what the conversation will contain. He looks like me, Daniel does, in the structural way that sons sometimes resemble fathers. Not identical, but the same underlying architecture expressed with someone else's variations. He sat down across from me and put his hands on the table and didn't say anything immediately, which was right. Thomas arrived shortly after with Rachel. They'd driven from Bend together, which was a small detail that told me Thomas had thought this through enough to know he didn't want to come alone. We ordered coffee, the small, ordinary activity of it, the brief conversation with the server, the ritual of deciding what you wanted, the moment of normalcy before the abnormal conversation, served the same function it always serves in difficult situations. It reminded everyone in the room that they were still, underneath the difficulty, ordinary people having a conversation in a cafe rather than participants in something that required dramatic postures. When the coffee arrived, I placed the original email on the table. Both pages, the complete version that had been in Martin's box, with the middle section intact, the section that contained Nora's explanation. I said, "You were right about one thing. I kept something from you. They looked at me. I said, but you were wrong about why. Daniel looked at the email, then at me. Then why didn't you just tell us? I said. Because someone trusted me with something that wasn't mine to reveal. Thomas asked, even to us? I paused. Especially to you, I said. The room was quiet, and outside the cafe window, the Willamette River moved at its October pace, deliberate and continuous, and entirely indifferent to what was happening in the room beside it, the way rivers are indifferent to the conversations that take place along their banks, which is one of the reasons people have always chosen rivers for conversations they needed to have. I hadn't yet told them about the box, about Martin, about Nora's letter, about the complete email and the missing section and everything that the box had contained. I was going to tell them all of it. But first I needed them to understand one thing. Before I explained what Nora had done and why Martin had the box and what the complete email revealed, before all of that, I needed them to understand what I was not going to tell them. Because what I was about to ask them to accept was not an explanation. It was a frame. And whether they could live inside that frame, without the full picture, whether they could accept that there was a real reason for the silence without knowing the specific content of the reason, was the test that Nora had written her letter in anticipation of. It was also, I understood now, the test I should have offered them years ago. I reached into my coat pocket. I put a single photograph on the table. The one from Merrifield Avenue. Nora and me, outside our former house, in the year I still couldn't place exactly but knew as the year things were still uncomplicated. On the back, he promised he would never tell them. Daniel looked at the photograph. Then at me, he said, "That's Mom's handwriting." "Yes," I said. And then, for the first time in the years since Nora died, for the first time in the years since the archive decision and the quiet that followed and the email that circulated in incomplete form and the 6 weeks of birthday silence and the October rain on Martin Keene's window, I began telling my family what I could. Not everything, but enough. The frame. And what happened when I finished placing it before them was something I had not predicted, which is the way the most important moments usually work. I told them what I could. Not in the dramatic sense of a revelation delivered with force. Not the way scenes like this are sometimes imagined, with a table of people hanging on each word and a speaker who has orchestrated the moment for maximum effect. It was quieter than that. More like a careful description of a photograph's composition. Here is what you can see. Here is the edge of what the frame contains. Here is what exists beyond the edge and why I'm not going to show it to you. I told them about the archive, about the request that had come in years earlier, asking for access to a specific photograph from the collection. About my decision to decline, about the fact that I had declined without explanation, which I now understood had been the point at which the misunderstanding had been given its initial shape. Daniel said, "We knew about the decline. That's not what concerned us." "I know," I said. "What concerned you was that you couldn't understand why. And you never told us." "No," I said. "I didn't." Thomas had his hands around his coffee cup. He was watching me with the particular attention he brings to things he's decided are important. The full-front engagement that is his natural mode, the one that makes him easy to talk to because you never have to wonder if he's actually listening. He said, "Dad, just say it plainly." I looked at him. "The reason I didn't tell you," I said, "is because the reason belonged to someone else. Someone who had trusted me with something private and had asked me to keep it private. And I made a decision, which I still believe was correct, that honoring that trust was more important than explaining myself." Rachel said, "Who was the person?" I said, "I can't tell you that." She looked at me steadily. "Even now?" "Even now," I said, "because the trust wasn't conditional on the circumstances remaining comfortable for me. If I break a confidence the moment keeping it becomes costly, it wasn't really a confidence to begin with. It was just a secret I held until something more convenient came along." The table was quiet. Daniel looked at the photograph of Nora and me, at the sentence on the back. He looked at it the way an engineer looks at a structural diagram, trying to identify the load-bearing elements, trying to understand the logic of how one thing connects to another. He said, "Mom wrote this." "Yes." She knew about whatever it was. Yes. And she knew you were keeping it. Yes, I said. She knew because she was involved in the original decision. She understood why I made the choice I made. I paused. She also understood, better than I did at the time, that the choice had consequences I hadn't fully considered. Rachel said, "The email." Yes. The email Daniel found. That was her trying to explain it to someone. To her cousin Dorothy, I said. She was explaining the situation. The email contained the full explanation. But the version that reached Daniel was missing the section that mattered most. Daniel said, "How do you know what the email said?" I reached into the inner pocket of my coat, removed the 2 pages, the complete email with the middle section intact, the section that had been absent from the forwarded version Daniel had received. I set it on the table between us. "Martin Keene," I said. "My neighbor. He had the original." Daniel looked at me. "Why did your neighbor have an email my mother wrote years ago?" "Because Nora gave it to him," I said, "along with other things. In a box she asked him to keep until he needed to use it." I paused. She anticipated that something like this might happen. She prepared for it the way she prepared for everything she was afraid might happen, quietly, without telling anyone, with very specific instructions about what to do and when. Thomas set down his coffee cup. He said, "She prepared for the possibility that we might stop speaking to you." Yes. The word landed in the room and stayed there. I gave them a moment with it, the moment that the sentence required. Not to be dramatic, but because some pieces of information need a specific amount of time to be absorbed before the conversation can move forward without losing them. Rachel was the first to speak. She said, "She knew us well enough to know we might do that." "She knew family dynamics well enough," I said. "Not necessarily your specific response. But she understood that incomplete information in a family, over time, can produce conclusions that the complete information wouldn't support. She understood that because she'd seen it happen in other families, in other contexts, and she understood that my habit of silence made it more likely than it might have been otherwise." Daniel said, "Your habit of silence." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She wrote that in the email." "Something like it," I said. "Read the middle section." He picked up the 2 pages, found the section that had been missing from his version, read it. His expression moved through several stages as he read, the specific movement of someone encountering information that reorganizes the structure of what they thought they understood. Not dramatic. Not the theatrical expression of a person whose world has been turned upside down. The quieter, more real expression of a person whose world has remained basically intact, but whose map of it has just been corrected. He set the pages down. He said, "She was defending you." "Yes." "She was telling Dorothy that you made the decision because she'd asked you to." "Yes," Thomas said, "and that section got lost." "Or left out," I said. "Not intentionally, as far as Martin can tell. But a forwarded email with a missing page is as misleading as a photograph with half the frame removed. What you see isn't wrong, but it isn't the whole thing." Rachel said, "Samuel." It was the first time she'd used my name in the conversation. She has always called me Samuel, not Sam, which other people sometimes use, but my full name with the specific respect of someone who believes names deserve to be said completely. "I need to ask you something directly." "Please," I said. "Did you ever consider just telling us? Not the specific thing, if there was a confidence to keep, but telling us that a confidence existed? That there was a reason you couldn't explain?" The question deserved a completely honest answer. I said, "No." She waited. "Not because I decided against it," I said. "Because it didn't occur to me. I was so accustomed to keeping the silence that the silence had become invisible to me. I couldn't see it as something I was doing because it was just how I was. I thought I was simply being appropriately discreet. I didn't understand that what other people were experiencing was not discretion but absence." I looked at my sons. "Your mother saw it clearly," I said. "She wrote it in her letter to me. She said I became quiet, and that quiet was never neutral for the people who loved me. She said silence doesn't just sit where you put it. It moves into other people's understanding and takes the shape of whatever worries them most. I paused. I should have told you years ago that there were things I couldn't tell you and why I couldn't tell them. Not the content, the frame. You could have lived with the frame. What you couldn't live with, what nobody can live with, is believing they have the whole picture when they don't. Thomas said, "That's not what we believed." Not exactly. I looked at him. He said, "I knew there was something. I knew there was more than what the email showed, even before Martin came to your door. I knew because I know you." He looked at his hands. But Daniel was so certain, and once I was the only one who wasn't certain, it became easier to let the certainty carry me than to fight it. Daniel said, "Tom." Thomas looked at his brother. "You should have told me," Daniel said. "If you weren't certain, you should have said so." "You didn't want to hear it," Thomas said. Not defensively, accurately. "You'd already decided, and I didn't know how to stand in the way of a decision you'd already made without it becoming something bigger than the original question." This was the family doing what families do when the surface conversation reaches a depth that requires them to talk to each other rather than to the external problem. I let it happen. It wasn't my conversation to manage. Rachel said, "We all stopped asking." She looked around the table. "That's what I keep coming back to. We had the email. We had our interpretation of the email. And not one of us picked up the phone and said, 'Dad, we found something. We need to talk about it.' We just decided. And then we let the decision create distance." Daniel said, "I was angry." "I know," I said. "Not because I was certain you'd done something wrong," he said. "Because I didn't know, and not knowing felt worse than being angry." I understood that completely. Uncertainty is its own specific discomfort. It doesn't have the clean edges of a clear emotion. It doesn't give you anything to do with it. Anger is a response. Uncertainty is just a condition, and conditions are harder to carry than responses. I said, "You were all talking about me because you were afraid to talk to me." Nobody answered immediately. That silence was different from the 6 weeks of silence that had preceded the birthday. That silence had been the silence of distance. People removing themselves from a situation they didn't want to face. This silence was something else. This was people sitting with an accurate statement about themselves and not rushing to contradict it. After a moment, Rachel said, "Yes." One word. But she said it with the full weight of someone who has confirmed something true about themselves and is not going to diminish it by surrounding it with qualifications. I reached into my coat pocket again. I produced the copies of the 4 photographs. The ones Martin had brought to my door the night before, the ones with Nora's handwriting on the back. I set them on the table, face down, the handwriting facing up. He thinks silence protects people. He doesn't know what they heard. If they ever find out, they will blame him. I never wanted this to happen. Daniel read the sentences, then turned the photographs over and looked at the images. Thomas read the sentences. He was quiet for a long time after. Rachel read the sentences and then looked at me with the expression of a woman who is arriving at a complete understanding of something from a direction she hadn't expected. She said, "She knew." "Yes," I said. "She knew well enough to prepare for it." Thomas said, "While she was still alive. She sat down and prepared for the possibility that we'd misunderstand you after she was gone." "Yes." He was quiet. Then he said, "And she gave the materials to your neighbor, someone who wouldn't be involved emotionally, someone who could deliver them without the delivery being complicated by his own feelings about the situation." "Yes," I said. "She was very precise about the logistics." Thomas almost smiled. "That was Mom." "It was," I said. And there it was. The specific warmth that enters a room when a group of people who loved the same person recognize her in something she did. Not grief exactly, though grief was present. Recognition. The particular pleasure of encountering someone's characteristic precision and being able to name it and smile at it because it was so completely theirs. I want to stop here and say something directly, because this moment, this small, ordinary moment of people recognizing Nora in a logistical decision she made years before she died, is the kind of moment that gets lost in stories about family misunderstanding and reconciliation. The big moments get told, the confrontations, the revelations, the apologies. But the small moments are often where the actual repair happens. The repair doesn't happen because someone proves they were right. It happens because everyone in the room remembers simultaneously why they loved each other in the first place. If you've been in a version of this room, if you've sat at a table with people who matter to you and felt the specific quality of a real conversation after a long absence of real conversations, you know what I mean. And if you haven't been there yet, stay with this story because the next part is what I think matters most. Daniel put his hand flat on the table, not reaching for anything, not a gesture toward anyone, just placing his hand on the surface of the table in the way people sometimes do when they need to feel the solidity of something while they process something else. He said, "I owe you an apology." I started to speak. He said, "Let me say it." I waited. He said, "I found that email and I decided what it meant before I asked you. I decided, and then I shared the decision with Thomas and Rachel without offering them the option of uncertainty. And then the three of us created a situation that hurt you, that made you spend 6 weeks wondering what you'd done wrong and preparing dinner for 2 people on your birthday. And I could have prevented all of it by picking up the phone and asking you one question." He looked at me. "I'm sorry, Dad," I said. "I contributed to it." "I know," he said, "but that doesn't remove my part." Thomas said, "Same." Rachel said, "I should have called you, independent of what Daniel believed. I should have called you and asked you directly." I looked at the three of them. I said, "Here's what I know. You didn't stop coming because you stopped loving me. You stopped coming because you believed something about me that frightened you, and you didn't know how to approach it. That's something I understand. I've spent my whole life not approaching things directly when approaching them directly felt too complicated." Daniel said, "You're defending us." "I'm being accurate," I said. "There's a difference." Something settled in the room after that. Not a resolution exactly. Resolution is too clean a word for what happens when a real misunderstanding gets addressed. It's more like the beginning of an adjustment. The initial recalibration of a relationship that has been operating on incorrect information returning to something closer to the truth. I reached into my coat one final time. I produced the last item, copies of the photograph from Merrifield Avenue, 4 copies which I had made at the print shop on the way to the cafe. I gave one to each of them and kept one for myself. It was just a photograph. Nora and me outside our former house, in an uncomplicated year, with the light doing what good light does in a well-composed photograph, illuminating without overexposing, revealing without flattening. On the back of each copy, I had written Nora's sentence in my own handwriting. Families don't fall apart because they disagree. They fall apart when everyone becomes afraid of the conversation. I said, "She wrote that. I found it among her things. I don't know exactly when she wrote it, but I've been thinking about it since last night, and I think it's the most accurate thing I've encountered in the past 6 weeks." Thomas turned the photograph over. Read the sentence. Turned it back. Daniel read it and set it face up on the table beside his coffee. Rachel looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "She left all of this for you." "For us," I said. "All of it." The box was for me because I was the one who would need to receive it first. But what was in the box was always meant to reach this table. We sat together for a while after that, not discussing the archive, not revisiting the specifics of the misunderstanding, not performing the kind of extended processing of a difficult experience that sometimes substitutes for actually moving through it. We just sat. We ordered more coffee. Thomas mentioned something about a project he'd been working on in Bend. Daniel talked about a bridge assessment he'd been involved with in the north part of the state. Rachel told me about a community garden she'd joined, which had been Nora's kind of thing. The organized, purposeful engagement with a local project that Nora had always found meaningful. I listened to all of it with the specific quality of attention you have when you've been given back something you didn't know had been taken. We talked for almost 2 hours. In the months that followed, things changed in the way that things change when the change is real, rather than performed. Not dramatically, not all at once, not with the accelerated warmth of people trying to compensate for the time they've lost. Gradually, the way a photograph develops when the chemistry is right and the timing is careful. Daniel started coming by on Sundays. Not every Sunday, He has his own life and his own schedule, and I didn't want the visits to become obligatory, which would have changed their quality from connection to maintenance. But most Sundays, we had a pattern going of coffee in the morning and sometimes a walk if the weather allowed, which in Eugene is an optimistic approach to outdoor plans, but one that produces good results when it works out. Thomas called more regularly. We had started having the kind of phone calls that go longer than either of us intended because the conversation kept finding another direction worth following. He told me things he was working through. I told him things I was thinking about. We talked about Nora sometimes. Not in the careful, managed way that people talk about the recently deceased when they're still being protective of each other's feelings, but in the ordinary way of people discussing someone they both loved and who is now simply part of the history they share. Rachel visited alone once. On a Wednesday afternoon when she'd driven down from the north on her own, she brought a book she thought I'd like. A collection of photographs from a 20th century Oregon documentary project, the kind of careful, observational work that had always interested me more than the technically brilliant but emotionally absent variety of photography. She sat at my kitchen table and we talked about photography for a while, which we hadn't done before. Rachel and I had always talked through Daniel, always in the context of family occasions rather than in the ordinary context of two people who might find they have things to say to each other directly. She said at one point, "You never showed me your own photographs." I said, "No." "Do you still have them?" "Most of them." She said, "I'd like to see them, not all at once, but sometime." I said, "Come back Thursday." She came back Thursday. I showed her the work I was proudest of, not the documentary archive material, not the community project photographs, but the personal work, the photographs I had made across 40 years that weren't assignments or teaching examples or professional projects. The photographs I made because something asked to be photographed and I had the equipment to answer. She looked at them with the attention of someone who was genuinely interested, which is different from the polite attention of someone performing interest out of family obligation. She asked questions about specific images, about decisions I had made, about what I had been trying to do, and whether I thought I had done it. At one point, she held a photograph, a landscape from the coast, shot in winter, with the specific quality of gray that the Oregon coast has in January, when the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look like it's being remembered rather than currently experienced. And she said, "This one looks like how grief feels." I said, "I took it the winter after Nora died." She said, "I know." She set it down carefully, the way you set down something that deserves careful treatment. Then she said, "Samuel, I want to say something." "Go ahead." "I've been thinking about what you said at the cafe, about the silence becoming the thing people fill with their own fears." She paused. "I think I did that with you generally, not just about the archive. I think I'd been looking at the fact that you lived alone and that you were quiet and that you never asked for things, and I'd been filling that silence with the assumption that you were fine, that you didn't need anything, that you were managing." I said, "I was managing." "I know," she said, "but managing isn't the same as not needing anything. And I think I used your independence as a reason not to ask." She looked at me. "That wasn't fair." I said, "I made it easy to do. That doesn't make it right." We were quiet for a moment. Then I said, "Rachel, you are here on a Thursday afternoon with a book and genuine questions about photographs. I think you're doing the thing you're describing." She smiled. "Trying to." "That's what it looks like," I said. "From this side." Martin came over for dinner the following week. A proper dinner, not a doorstep conversation in the rain. He sat at the table where I'd set 2 places on my birthday, and we talked about the neighborhood and about his years at the Postal Service and about the specific pleasure of retiring from a job where you spent your entire career ensuring that things reached the right people at the right time and then having the freedom to spend your evenings however you wanted. I told him about the cafe conversation, about what had been said and how it had landed, and what the week since had looked like. He said, "She'd have been glad." "Yes," I said. "She would." He said, "She was worried. About you specifically. After she was gone. She thought you'd become quieter than was good for you." She was probably right about that too. "She usually was," Martin said, "in my limited experience." "In my extensive one," I said. We ate dinner and talked about other things, and the evening was exactly the ordinary kind of evening that evenings should be when everything that needed to be said has been said, and what's left is just the pleasure of being in a room with another person who is glad to be there. Several months after the cafe, I went back to the archive, not to revisit the original decision. That decision remained what it was, and what it had been, and I had no intention of revising it. I went because I had been thinking about something Nora had written in her letter, about the frame, about the difference between a silence that acknowledges itself and a silence that pretends to be a complete account. I spoke with the current archive administrator, a woman who had taken over the project in the years since the original disagreement, who had not been present for any of what had happened, and who was managing the collection with the careful attention that the material deserved. I told her that a past access decision involving certain photographs had never been formally explained in the archive's records. I told her that the decision had been made to honor a privacy request, that the specific nature of the request remained private, but that the record should reflect the existence of a reason rather than appearing to be arbitrary. She updated the record. It said, "Access declined at request of photograph subject 2014. Reason held in confidence per subject's instruction, not the content. The frame." That was enough. I drove home from the archive on a November afternoon that had the specific quality of Oregon November, rain that had paused briefly but not ended, the kind of afternoon light that appears between weather events as though by accidental arrangement, the mountains visible to the east in a way they often aren't. I drove along the river and thought about Nora preparing a box for a neighbor she wouldn't live to meet, and trusting that the box would reach me when I needed it and that I would know what to do with what it contained. I thought about the second plate I'd set on my birthday, about 8:17 p.m., and a knock on the door that changed the frame. I parked in the driveway of 1178 Alderbrook Terrace and sat in the car for a moment in the way I sometimes do when I want to give a day its due before moving into the next part of it. The house was lit from inside. I'd left the kitchen light on, which I do now more than I used to, because a lit house looks like a house that expects someone to come home to it. My phone rang. "Daniel." I answered. He said, "Are you home?" I smiled. "Yes," he said. "Good. We're bringing coffee." I looked toward the driveway, the empty driveway for the moment. In a little while it wouldn't be empty. I thought about the 6 weeks when nobody came, about what I had begun telling myself in those 6 weeks, in the hours when the quiet of the house was loudest, that I had somehow become difficult to be around, that the people who loved me had found their way to a version of their lives that had less room for me than I'd thought, that the natural drift of things was simply taking the shape I'd most feared, and that the appropriate response was to adjust to it. That was the thought I'd been most afraid of, not the misunderstanding, not the archive decision or the missing email or any of the specific content of what had happened. The thought that the distance might be permanent, that I might have become, without knowing how or when, someone whose absence from the people he loved had grown to the point where the people he loved no longer noticed it. That thought, I now knew, had been wrong, not because nothing had changed, but because the thing that had changed had never been love. It had been fear. Their fear of approaching something they didn't understand. My fear of discovering that I had done something I hadn't known I'd done. All of us circling the same misunderstanding from different directions, and somehow never arriving at the center of it until Martin knocked on my door at 8:17 on a Tuesday night. I got out of the car, went inside. The kitchen light was on, and the house smelled like the morning's coffee, which is what a house smells like when someone has been living in it and will continue to live in it, which is a smell I had stopped taking for granted in the months since all of this began. I had enough time to put the kettle on before the headlights appeared in the driveway. For 6 weeks, I had thought my family had stopped visiting because they had stopped loving me. I was wrong. They had stopped coming because they believed a story about me that I had accidentally helped create. A story made from a real decision, an incomplete email, a family's tendency to fill silence with their most convenient fear, and my lifelong habit of keeping things quiet in ways I believed were protective, and that were, at least in part, exactly that, and also, in ways I hadn't seen, something else entirely. I spent years protecting a promise with silence. I learned that keeping someone's confidence does not mean disappearing from the people who love you. It means giving them enough of the truth to understand why you can't give them all of it. It means saying, there is a frame here, and this is its edge. And what's beyond the edge is not mine to show you. It means trusting that the people who love you can live with the frame if they know the frame exists. Nora knew that. She wrote it in a letter she left in a box for a neighbor she hadn't met yet, to be delivered at a moment she anticipated with the specific accuracy of someone who had loved a quiet man for decades and understood what his quietness might cost him. She was right. She was right about most things. When the knock came, the following Sunday, I didn't ask who it was. I already knew. For the first time in months, I opened the door before they had to knock twice. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever been the one whose silence was misread, or the one who stopped reaching out because you were afraid of what you'd find, or simply someone who recognized in Samuel's quiet house the particular sound of a distance you never meant to create, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me which moment in this story you recognized. Tell me about the conversation you've been circling. Tell me about the photograph with the missing section, the email that only told half the story, the frame you've been living inside without knowing it was incomplete. Because this channel exists for these stories, the real ones, the ones about ordinary people loving each other imperfectly and finding their way through the imperfection toward something more honest than what they had before. If that's what you want to keep hearing, subscribe. Hit the notification bell so you're there when the next story arrives. Every story I bring you is developed the same way a careful photograph is developed, with attention to what the light reveals, respect for what the frame contains, and patience for the full image to become visible. I'll see you in the next one.